The ice-cold waters of the Delaware River lapped against the wooden boats as General George Washington stood silently in the bow, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the New Jersey shore ahead. It was December 26th, 1776, and the Continental Army was about to embark on what many would later call the most audacious military gamble in American history. But this story isn't just about crossing a frozen river on Christmas night. It's about how a desperate follow-up battle 10 days later would fundamentally alter the course of human freedom. Washington's army was dying, not from British bullets, but from something far more insidious: despair. The revolutionary cause that had burned so brightly just months earlier was now flickering like a candle in a winter storm. Enlistments were expiring by the thousands, and men were simply walking away from their posts, trudging home through the snow to farms and families they feared they'd never see again. The situation was so dire that even Washington's most trusted advisors whispered of surrender. Thomas Paine had captured the national mood perfectly when he wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." The British controlled New York, Philadelphia seemed within their grasp, and Loyalist sentiment was surging throughout the colonies. King George III's professional armies, led by experienced generals like Lord Cornwallis and Colonel Johann Rall, appeared unstoppable. As referenced in David Hackett Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing, the Continental Army had shrunk from over 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. These weren't the eager volunteers who had rushed to join the cause after Lexington and Concord. These were the hardcore farmers, tradesmen, and laborers who had somehow found the strength to endure when others end. The immediate aftermath of the surprise victory at Trenton on December 26th had provided a brief morale boost. But Washington knew it wasn't enough. The British would regroup, reinforcements would arrive, and the window of opportunity would slam shut. What the Continental Army needed wasn't just another tactical victory. It needed a strategic triumph that would prove the rebels could stand toe-to-toe with European professionals in open battle. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, watched his commander study the maps spread across the rough wooden table in their makeshift headquarters. The young officer could see the weight of decision pressing down on Washington's shoulders like a physical burden. Every choice carried the potential for either salvation or catastrophe. There would be no second chances. The plan taking shape in Washington's mind was characteristically bold. While Lord Cornwallis rushed south with 8,000 British troops to crush what he assumed was a ragtag band of rebels, Washington would execute a tactical masterpiece that would catch the enemy completely off guard. But the target wasn't Trenton. Again, it was Princeton, a small college town that held the key to controlling Central New Jersey. Princeton might have seemed like an unlikely place to change the course of world history. Home to the College of New Jersey, it was a quiet academic community where professors debated philosophy and theology, while their students prepared for careers in law and ministry. But in early January of 1777, this peaceful town would become the stage for a battle that would demonstrate something profound about the nature of American resolve. As Washington's exhausted soldiers prepared for what many sensed would be their final campaign, none could have imagined that their next fight would not only save the revolution, but establish principles of citizen soldiery and democratic resilience that would inspire freedom movements for centuries to come. Lord Charles Cornwallis was no ordinary British general. The Earl of Cornwallis had earned his reputation fighting in Europe and India, where his tactical brilliance had crushed rebellion after rebellion. He marched his 8,000 seasoned troops south toward Trenton on January 2nd, 1777. He carried with him the confident expectation of ending American resistance once and for all. "We've got the old fox safe now," Cornwallis reportedly told his officers as they made camp near Trenton. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." The metaphor was apt. Washington's 3,000 soldiers appeared trapped between the Delaware River and superior British forces. Every conventional military principle suggested that the Continental Army would be destroyed within hours, but Washington was playing a different game entirely. While Cornwallis settled in for the night, convinced his prey was cornered, the American commander was orchestrating one of history's most brilliant tactical deceptions. The plan required splitting his already diminished force into 2 columns and executing a night march over unfamiliar terrain in freezing weather, the kind of maneuver that military textbooks warned against attempting. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, would lead 1 column along the back roads toward Princeton, while Brigadier General Hugh Mercer took his Virginia and Pennsylvania troops along a parallel route. The main force would follow, leaving behind only enough men to keep the campfires burning and create the illusion that the entire army remained in position. It was a gamble that defied military logic, but Washington understood something his opponents didn't. Desperate times demanded impossible solutions. The march began at 1 o'clock in the morning on January 3rd. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the muddy roads had turned into treacherous sheets of ice. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags because most lacked proper boots, leaving bloody footprints in the snow as they stumbled forward through the darkness. Many carried muskets that hadn't been properly cleaned or maintained, weapons that might misfire at the crucial moment. As dawn approached, Washington's columns converged on Princeton from 2 directions. The town appeared peaceful. In the early morning light, with smoke rising from chimneys and students presumably still asleep in their dormitories, but appearance was deceiving. Princeton was defended by seasoned British and Hessian troops under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, professional soldiers who had been stationed there to guard the vital supply lines connecting New York to Philadelphia. General Mercer's Virginia Brigade encountered the 1st British patrol just south of the town, near the Stony Brook Bridge. What followed was a vicious firefight that would determine whether Washington's audacious plan would succeed or result in catastrophe. Mercer, a Scottish-born physician who had served with Washington during the French and Indian War, led his men forward with characteristic courage, but the British response was swift and devastating. The Redcoats, commanded by Captain William Leslie, formed disciplined firing lines and delivered volleys that shattered Mercer's advance. The general himself fell, mortally wounded by bayonet thrusts, and his brigade began to waver. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that Washington's entire strategy was collapsing. American militiamen, seeing their leader down and British steel gleaming in the morning sun, began to break ranks and flee. This was the crisis point, the moment when the American Revolution could have died in a frozen field outside Princeton. Washington, hearing the sound of musket fire ahead, spurred his horse forward through the chaos, determined to salvage victory from the jaws of defeat. What happened next would become the stuff of legend, but it was also a turning point that revealed something fundamental about American character. The sight of their commander-in-chief riding directly into enemy fire had an electrifying effect on the Continental soldiers. These weren't professional warriors following orders, they were citizens defending their homes. And Washington's personal courage reminded them why they were fighting. The morning mist clung to the frozen ground as Washington galloped toward the sound of gunfire, his great bay horse thundering across the icy terrain. Behind him rode his staff officers, including young Captain Alexander Hamilton and Colonel Joseph Reed, men who would later help shape the new nation, but who at this moment were simply trying to keep pace with their seemingly fearless commander. What Washington saw as he crested the small hill overlooking the Princeton battlefield would have broken the spirit of a lesser man. General Mercer lay dying in the snow, his scarlet blood creating a stark contrast against the white ground. The Virginia and Pennsylvania militiamen who had followed him so courageously were now streaming backward in disorder, their faces etched with the particular terror that comes when citizen soldiers first encounter professional military violence. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood's British forces were executing a textbook counterattack, their redcoats moving in perfect formation as they advanced with fixed bayonets. These were veterans of European campaigns, men who had broken French cavalry charges and stormed Spanish fortresses. They moved with the mechanical precision of a clockwork army, each soldier knowing exactly where he belonged and what he must do. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the fate of American independence hung in the balance. The British had superior numbers at the point of contact, better training, the psychological advantage of having just shattered an enemy attack. Military doctrines suggested they should press their advantage and complete the destruction of Washington's forces. But Washington made a decision that defied every principle of 18th-century warfare. Instead of remaining safely behind his lines where a commanding general belonged, he rode directly into the chaos, positioning himself between his retreating men and the advancing British. His aide-de-camp later wrote that the general seemed to bear a charmed life as musket balls whistled past his head and grape shot from British artillery scattered dirt around his horse's hooves. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," Washington shouted to his wavering troops. "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." His voice carried across the battlefield with remarkable clarity, and something in his tone, not just authority, but absolute conviction, began to steady the American ranks. Captain Hamilton, watching from nearby, would later describe this moment as the instant when George Washington transformed from a Virginia planter into the embodiment of American determination. The general's willingness to share the same risks as his common soldiers created a bond that transcended traditional military hierarchy. These men weren't just following orders anymore. They were following a leader who valued their cause more than his own life. The effect was immediate and dramatic. American militiamen who had been fleeing moments earlier now turned and formed rough battle lines. Their muskets might be inferior to British weapons, and their uniforms might be patched and threadbare. But their resolve had been rekindled by Washington's example. They began to advance, their battle cry echoing across the frozen fields. Meanwhile, Captain William Washington's cavalry had succeeded in flanking the British position, creating confusion in Mohud's ranks. The British commander, suddenly facing attacks from multiple directions, began to realize that this wasn't the ragtag band of rebels he had expected to face. These Americans were fighting with a fury that professional soldiers rarely encountered, the desperation of men defending their homes and families. The tide of battle began to turn as American artillery, commanded by Captain Alexander Hamilton and Lieutenant James Monroe, future founding fathers, began to find their range. Their cannons, captured from the Hessians at Trenton just days earlier, now spoke with deadly accuracy against their former owners. British soldiers, accustomed to European battlefields where armies withdrew after taking moderate casualties, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed willing to absorb enormous losses rather than retreat. What happened next would become one of the defining moments of the American Revolution. A demonstration that citizen soldiers motivated by the right cause could indeed stand against the finest professional armies in the world. Nassau Hall. The imposing stone edifice that housed the College of New Jersey had witnessed many historic moments since its construction in 1756. Presidents and governors had spoken from its steps. Theological debates had raged in its classrooms, and generations of young men had prepared for careers in law, medicine, and ministry within its walls. But on January 3rd, 1777, this center of learning was about to become the focal point of a battle that would help determine the future of human liberty. As Washington's reinvigorated forces pressed their attack, Lieutenant Colonel Mohud found his British troops in an increasingly desperate situation. The Americans weren't fighting like European armies, which typically withdrew after suffering moderate casualties. Instead, these colonial militiamen seemed to possess an almost supernatural determination to continue fighting despite their losses. It was a phenomenon that British commanders throughout the war would struggle to understand. The key to Mohud's defensive position was Nassau Hall itself. The massive stone building provided excellent cover for his troops. While its commanding position overlooked the surrounding terrain, British soldiers had barricaded themselves inside, turning the college's windows into firing ports and its doorways into defensive strongpoints. If the Americans wanted to claim Princeton, they would have to storm the most formidable building in central New Jersey. Captain Hamilton, despite his youth, recognized the tactical significance immediately. "We must take that building," he told Washington as they surveyed the battlefield. "As long as the British hold Nassau Hall, they can control the entire town and prevent our forces from advancing toward New Brunswick." The Treasury was already displaying the strategic thinking that would later help him design America's financial system. Washington nodded grimly. A frontal assault on Nassau Hall would be costly in both time and life's resources his army could ill afford to waste. But he also understood that half measures would not suffice. The psychological impact of this battle would far exceed its tactical importance. If the Continental Army could demonstrate its ability to storm a fortified position held by British regulars, it would send a message that would resonate throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. The assault began with American artillery, targeting Nassau Hall's windows and main entrances. Captain Hamilton personally sighted one of the cannons, and his first shot reportedly decapitated a portrait of King George II hanging in the college's main hall.
A symbolic moment.
That would be remembered long after the war ended. The irony was not lost on the combatants. A building dedicated to higher learning had become a battleground between Old World authority and New World. Democracy, as referenced in Thomas Fleming's comprehensive study The Perils of Peace, the Battle of Princeton represented a crucial test of whether American forces could maintain their momentum after Trenton. The British response to their defeat had been swift, and professional reinforcements were already marching from New York. And Cornwallis had turned his army around to pursue Washington. Time was running desperately short. British soldiers inside Nassau Hall fought with the disciplined courage expected of professional troops, but they were trapped in an impossible situation. American forces had surrounded the building, cutting off all escape routes, while artillery fire made remaining. Inside, increasingly hazardous, the thick stone walls that provided protection also became a prison. As there was no way to retreat without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire, Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, recognizing that his position had become untenable, made the difficult decision to attempt a breakout. Leading a small force of his best men, he charged from Nassau Hall's main entrance, hoping to create enough confusion to allow the remainder of his troops to escape toward New Brunswick. It was a brave but desperate gambit that would determine whether Princeton would fall to Washington's forces. The fighting that followed was intense and personal. As American and British soldiers clashed at close quarters on the college grounds, students who had fled their dormitories watched from safe distances as their peaceful campus became a battlefield where the future of their continent was being decided. Many of these young men would later become leaders of the new republic, and the memory of this day would influence their understanding of the price of freedom. The outcome at Nassau Hall would prove decisive not just for the Battle of Princeton, but for the entire revolutionary cause. The white flag that appeared in Nassau Hall's main window seemed almost anticlimactic after the thunderous violence of the preceding hour. British soldiers, their red coats torn and blackened with gunpowder, filed out of the college building with their hands raised in surrender. For many of these professional warriors, it was their first taste of defeat at the hands of what they had been told were undisciplined colonial farmers. Captain Hamilton, his uniform splattered with mud and his face grimy from artillery smoke, accepted the British surrender with the formal courtesy that 18th-century warfare demanded, but beneath his diplomatic restraint, the young officer was exhilarated. The Continental Army had just accomplished something that European military experts had declared impossible. Citizen soldiers had defeated seasoned British regulars in open battle. Washington, however, knew that victory at Princeton was only meaningful if his army could escape before Cornwallis arrived with overwhelming reinforcements. British drums could already be heard in the distance, growing steadily louder as thousands of enemy troops marched toward the sound of gunfire. The general's tactical brilliance had won the battle, but strategic wisdom would be required to preserve his gains. "We must move immediately toward Morristown," Washington commanded his staff officers. "Every minute we delay gives Cornwallis another opportunity to trap us." The irony was bitter, having just achieved their most significant victory of the war. The Continental Army would have to retreat once again. But Washington understood that preserving his forces was more important than occupying territory. The American withdrawal from Princeton was as masterful as the attack had been. Washington's quartermaster had already identified several escape routes, and supply wagons were loaded with captured British equipment and provisions. More importantly, the army's morale had been completely transformed. Soldiers who had been on the verge of desertion just days earlier now marched with the confidence of men who had proven themselves in battle. The psychological impact of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate participants. News of the victory spread throughout the colonies with remarkable speed, carried by riders who galloped from town to town, shouting the incredible news. Washington had defeated the British again. This time, in a stand-up fight that demonstrated American military capability. Church bells rang from Boston to Charleston, and recruitment offices that had been nearly empty suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Princeton proved to European observers that the American Revolution was more than a regional rebellion. French military advisors, who had been skeptical about supporting what appeared to be a losing cause, began to reconsider their position. The tactical sophistication Washington had displayed deceiving Cornwallis, executing a difficult night march, and storming of fortified positions, jested that American commanders possessed genuine military competence. King Louis XVI's ministers, already inclined to oppose Britain for reasons of European power politics, now saw the American rebels as potentially valuable allies rather than hopeless underdogs. The diplomatic implications would prove enormous, as French support would eventually prove decisive in achieving American independence. Back in London, the news from Princeton sent shockwaves through the government of Lord North. British newspapers, which had been confidently predicting the imminent collapse of American resistance, were forced to acknowledge that the colonial rebellion was far from over. Parliament began to debate whether the costs of suppressing the uprising might exceed its potential benefits, exactly the kind of political doubt that Washington had hoped to create. The human cost of Princeton was significant, but not catastrophic. American casualties totaled fewer than 50 killed and wounded, while British losses exceeded 300, including many captured. More importantly, the Continental Army had seized vital supplies and equipment, resources that would help sustain them through the difficult winter months ahead. General Mercer's death cast a shadow over the celebration, but even his sacrifice served a larger purpose. The Virginia physician's willingness to die for American independence provided a powerful example of the commitment required to achieve freedom. His memory would inspire countless other volunteers to join the Continental cause. As Washington's army settled into winter quarters at Morristown, the full significance of Princeton began to emerge. The winter encampment at Morristown felt markedly different from the desperate retreat across New Jersey just weeks earlier. Continental soldiers who had been deserting by the hundreds now found themselves part of an army that foreign military observers were beginning to take seriously. The barracks were still cold, the food was still inadequate, and pay was still irregular. But something fundamental had changed. These men now believed they could win. Washington used the respite to rebuild his forces and consolidate the strategic advantages gained at Princeton. The victory had demonstrated that British control of America was far from absolute, encouraging fence-sitting colonists to openly support the revolutionary cause. Or pragmatically, it had also captured desperately needed supplies and equipment that would help sustain the Continental Army through the remainder of the winter. Intelligence reports reaching Morristown revealed the broader impact of Princeton on British strategy. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, had been forced to abandon his plans for a winter offensive and consolidate his forces in defensive positions around New York and Philadelphia. The psychological initiative, so crucial in 18th-century warfare, had shifted decisively to the Americans. European courts were paying close attention to developments in America, and Princeton provided concrete evidence that the colonial rebels possessed genuine military capability. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat who would soon join Washington's staff, later wrote that news of Princeton was the decisive factor in convincing him to volunteer for American service. His enthusiasm was shared by military adventurers throughout Europe who saw the American cause as both noble and potentially victorious. More significantly, King Louis XVI's government began serious discussions about providing covert support to the American rebels. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, argued that British difficulties in America presented France with an opportunity to reverse the humiliating defeats of the 7 Years' War. The tactical competence Washington had displayed at Princeton suggested that French money and supplies would be well invested rather than wasted on a hopeless cause. The diplomatic ramifications extended beyond France. Spain, the Netherlands, and other European powers began to reconsider their positions regarding the American conflict. A successful colonial rebellion against Britain would fundamentally alter the balance of European power, potentially creating opportunities for nations that had been overshadowed by British naval and commercial dominance. Within the American colonies, Princeton's impact was equally profound. Loyalist sentiment, which had been growing stronger throughout 1776, began to weaken as fence-sitters concluded that supporting the crown might not be the safe choice they had assumed. British authorities found it increasingly difficult to recruit local militias or secure reliable intelligence about Continental Army movements. The Continental Congress, meeting in Baltimore after fleeing Philadelphia, received news of Princeton. With enormous relief, many delegates had been privately discussing terms for a negotiated surrender. But Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton had bought them precious time to continue their work. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that the old fox has shown he possesses more cunning than his enemies suspected. Perhaps most importantly, Princeton established Washington's reputation as a military commander capable of strategic thinking beyond simple tactical competence. European military textbooks of the era emphasized that successful generals must possess not just courage and tactical skill, but the ability to understand the broader political and psychological dimensions of warfare. Washington's Princeton campaign demonstrated mastery of all these elements. The victory also validated the concept of citizen soldiers that was central to American revolutionary ideology. European armies of the 18th century were composed primarily of professional soldiers led by aristocratic officers, men who fought for pay rather than principle. Princeton proved that motivated civilians could not only compete with professionals, but could exceed their performance when fighting for deeply held beliefs. The long-term consequences of Princeton would extend far beyond the American Revolution itself, establishing precedents for democratic warfare that would influence military thinking for generations. 2.5 centuries after that frozen January morning in 1777, historians continued to debate the precise significance of the Battle of Princeton. But one conclusion seems indisputable. What happened in that small New Jersey college town fundamentally altered the trajectory of human freedom and established principles of democratic resilience that continue to shape our world today. The immediate military consequences of Princeton extended far beyond the tactical victory itself. Washington's demonstration that continental forces could defeat British regulars in conventional battle provided a template for future engagements throughout the Revolutionary War. American commanders gained confidence in their ability to stand toe-to-toe with European professionals, while British generals were forced to abandon their assumption that colonial troops would inevitably break when faced with disciplined resistance. More profoundly, Princeton established the credibility of citizen soldiers as an effective military force. This wasn't simply a matter of proving that Americans could fight. It was a validation of the revolutionary concept that free men defending their homes and principles could outperform hired mercenaries fighting for pay. The philosophical implications resonated far beyond the immediate military context, providing intellectual foundation for democratic societies throughout the world. The international ramifications proved equally significant. French military advisors, who had been skeptical about American prospects, began recommending covert support for the colonial cause. Within months, French gold and supplies were flowing to Continental forces, assistance that would prove decisive. At Yorktown 4 years later, without Princeton, it's questionable whether European powers would have viewed American independence as achievable, let alone worth supporting. The battle also demonstrated Washington's evolution from a competent but conventional military commander into a strategic genius capable of understanding warfare's political and psychological dimensions. His willingness to risk everything on audacious maneuvers like the Princeton campaign established patterns of bold leadership that would characterize his entire career, both military and political. Perhaps most importantly, Princeton proved that the American Revolution was more than a regional rebellion against British taxation policies. It was a fundamental challenge to the aristocratic assumptions that had governed European society for centuries. The sight of farmers and tradesmen defeating professional soldiers commanded by noblemen suggested that common people possessed capabilities that traditional social hierarchies had denied. The college town setting added symbolic weight to these broader implications. Nassau Hall, where future presidents and statesmen had studied, became a battlefield where the practical viability of democratic ideals was tested under fire. The metaphor was inescapable. American intellectual and military resistance were inextricably linked, both drawing strength from the revolutionary belief that ordinary citizens could govern themselves. Modern military historians recognize Princeton as a masterpiece of tactical deception and strategic timing. Washington's ability to outmaneuver superior British forces while maintaining the initiative demonstrated command skills that rank among history's finest. The campaign is still studied at military academies worldwide as an example of how audacity and careful planning can overcome numerical disadvantage, but Princeton's deepest significance transcends military history. It established a precedent for democratic societies facing existential threats that free people, properly led and motivated by just causes, possess reserves of strength that can overcome seemingly impossible odds. This lesson would resonate through subsequent American conflicts. From the Civil War through to world wars and beyond, the students who fled Nassau Hall as cannon fire shattered their dormitory windows would return after the war to complete their educations and help build the new republic. Many became leaders in law, politics, and education, carrying with them memories of the morning when their peaceful campus became the stage for a battle that helped secure human liberty. Today, visitors to Princeton University can walk the same grounds where Washington's soldiers charged British positions on that frozen January morning. A small monument marks the spot where General Mercer fell, and Nassau Hall still bears scars from American artillery. But the battle's true monument isn't made of stone. It's the continuing vitality of the democratic ideals that were proven viable on a New Jersey battlefield more than 2 centuries ago. The answer to why Princeton was so important isn't found in casualty figures or territorial gains, but in its demonstration that ordinary people, fighting for extraordinary principles, can indeed change the course of history.